We'll move on to our next presenter, which is Malcolm Macleod, who was an MEM student, and he worked where he studied the implementation and use of beaver dam flow devices. After realizing many ranchers viewed the keystone species as a pest, Macleod created the beaver deceiver, a flow device control in the form of a flexible pond lever. Macleod is working to help ranchers and beavers coexist to create the best overall land health. So I will let Malcolm take it away. I believe you should have sharing ability if you want to share your screen.
Thank you. Yes, I will share my screen and have a few slides here. So here we go. My name is Malcolm Macleod, and today we'll be talking about how working with beavers is necessary for creating more resilient water systems in the American West. This is North American beaver. It lives anywhere where there's wood and water. So its range here extends to the edge of the boreal forest up north and down to the southwestern desert in the south. Its current population is less than 10% of its historical numbers. I'm going to talk about beaver and then get into some other topics. But the reason for this population dwindle is because of the European fur trade. In the 17 and 1800s, the fur trade drove westward expansion. And beaver was the most valued pelt on the market, partially because its water-resistant properties made excellent hats, and that was a staple in European fashion. So the Europeans had already decimated beaver populations in their own continent, and so the fur traders were amazed at how many beavers there were in the New World. And these traders and trading companies killed as many as they could and made a whole lot of money from it. However, this had profound impacts on the hydrology and resulted in a much drier landscape in the West. Beavers are ecosystem engineers because they create wetlands. They do this by building dams, which serve as speed bumps, which slow the flow of water and spread it across the landscape. They also increase the duration time of water in a landscape. And this raises the groundwater table, which has a cascading effect on vegetation and creates really valuable wetlands, which are amazing wildlife habitat. In the American West, wetlands only account for about 3% of the land, yet the majority of all animals depend on wetlands at some point in their life cycle. In view of climate change, wetlands are even more important because this increased water storage serves as protection against drought. There's also been a lot of research showing that beaver-created wetlands serve as natural buffers for wildfire, prevent its spread. Wetlands also sequester carbon from the atmosphere, so they're a mitigation tool because they store that carbon in the sediment behind dams. Beaver dams also serve as filters, and they do this by leaching chemicals from the water into the pond sediment, and it's been shown that water quality is cleaner downstream of beaver dams. Could have a whole presentation on beaver biology, but the real point I want to get across is that as semi-aquatic animals, beavers build dams in order to move water to where they need to go, and that's mainly to access their food sources. Beavers are also farmers in the sense that building dams is their way of working the land to produce more food. Where they build dams, more water is impounded, raising the sub-irrigation and producing a lot more vegetation, which is their food source, and also attracts other animals. So eventually, beavers and these other animals knock back that food source, and beavers move on to another location and do the same work there. Beavers tend to rotate between 2 to 3 different sites, eventually coming back to their original land. Beavers are also key agents of landscape succession. They turn riverine forests into wetlands. And once those dams are abandoned, those beaver ponds turn into meadows. This is important because as Europeans were settling in the West, they chose these beaver meadows that had been removed of beaver as the place to establish their towns and farms because it was the most fertile soil around. Now that beavers are making a comeback, it has led to increased conflict between the two species. The most common form of conflict between humans and beavers are plugged up culverts. You can imagine that to a beaver, a road or a highway, it's just a really big dam, and a culvert is a big leak flowing through it. So the water flowing through the culvert, the sound and feel of it triggers the instinct in the beaver to plug up that leak. So they dam up the culvert, and this raises the water level so that eventually floods out roads. This is one example I found in Alabama, but it happens all over, including in Gunnison. The most effective way to resolve road flooding caused by beaver while keeping the beaver on the landscape is to build a flow device. There's different types of flow devices depending on the problem. On a freestanding dam, you build a pipe system pond leveler, and that pipe going through the dam serves as a permanent leak in that dam, and it controls the water level by limiting the vertical growth of the dam. The cage prevents beaver from getting close enough to the intake of the pipe to realize where the source of the leak's coming from. The middle structure you see is a culvert protective fence that tries to discourage beaver from damming at all. And it does this by making the surface area that they need to dam on much larger. So these fences are at least 40 feet in perimeter, and it makes it so that beaver have to do a lot more work for a lot less results. The most effective way to resolve culvert conflicts, however, is to combine these two methods in a pipe and fence system. This builds a fence around a culvert, much smaller, so that it actually encourages beaver to dam along the fence. And then the pipe, and so they raise the water level so they have enough water to be happy, and the pipe keeps the water level below the road. This is Aberdeen Quarry on South Beaver Creek. I've been commissioned to build a flow device here because this dam had been spilling over and flooding out the ingress road. However, after installation, I later found out that the drainage area at this point is 50 square miles. And to give you context, the largest single flow device I know of can only handle 2 square mile drainage area. So this pipe system was able to keep the road dry and drop the water level in the low flow. However, I came to realize, and it was a hard lesson learned, that there is no flow device that can handle that big of a watershed after snow melt and in high flow. So last I went, the road is back underwater. And you know, the only real solutions I see at Aberdeen Quarry is either raising the level of the road to be higher than the pond, or just letting it become a wetland and having people enjoy it, not just for its historical, but also its ecological value as the only wetland in Hartman Rocks. Here's a pipe and fence system that was recently installed in a site that can be, where a pipe system and a flow device would be effective because the drainage area is less than 1 square mile. This is over by Pipe Plant Creek, past Taylor Reservoir. And once beaver dam along this fence, it will re-wet this wetland, and the pipe system will make it so that the water level remains below the road. Flow devices were originally invented in New England, where watershed sizes are much smaller than what we get in the West. Here's an example in South Park, Colorado. Another flow device installer, Mark Beardsley, was dealing with this road flooding and chose to build multiple structures. You can see that he built 5 structures in order to deal with this road flooding because of how big the watershed is. 3 of those structures are pond levelers, and 2 of those have double pipes. So you can imagine that's a lot. And it's just to show that in the American West, there's some beaver problems that just can't get solved through flow devices, because of the size of the watershed, and others where you just need innovative solutions, such as building multiple structures at one site. Working with beavers has provided me an immense amount of hope for the future. This diagram we see was developed by Utah State University, who's really been pioneering beaver-powered restoration. Since beavers restore wetlands as part, just naturally as part of their instinct, it makes it so that we can get more stream miles and wetland acres restored for the least amount of resources. in using Beaver. So Beaver is really the most cost-effective restoration tool that we have available. The problem is that a lot of the historical beaver habitat has been degraded, and a lot of these streams have been incised after their removal. And so there's not adequate habitat for them to do what they do best. The solution here is to build low-tech structures to increase the stream complexity, spread that water around so that we can start getting some more vegetative growth and recreate these wetlands. Once we can reestablish wetlands using this process-based restoration, beaver can be reintroduced and do the rest of the work, helping solve a lot of the problems that are making our future uncertain, especially water storage and climate resiliency. So in conclusion, promoting coexistence with beaver by building flow devices where that's a feasible solution, along with putting effort in reestablishing beaver habitats so that we can reintroduce them, is necessary for increasing the resiliency of our water systems. Thank you.
Thanks so much. That was awesome, Malcolm. There are a few, well, there's two questions that have been popping up. One was from Sam. He asked, what pressure is climate change putting on beavers? Is it having a net negative effect or a net positive effect?
Yes, 1 second. Let me figure out how to stop sharing. Okay, stop sharing. Yes, so climate change on beaver. Well, the thing about climate change, it is making a lot of climate, a lot of different weather events a lot more extreme, right? So a lot more wildfires and stuff. The thing with beaver, though, is that in their wetlands, they're not as affected by that. I mean, there's definitely been a drying out, but they're the ones who are keeping water on the landscape. So they're not as affected by climate change as we are. I don't know if that answered the question.
He followed up with, how do you prevent beaver populations from overgrowth causing more issues?
Yeah. So the main issue with overgrowth is mainly that they would damage human property, right? That's the main concern that we have when we talk about having too many beavers, because ecologically there's no such thing as, too many beavers, especially since we just have a fraction of the historical population or pre-European settlement. So the way, let's say with ranchers, right, who don't want beavers on their irrigation ditches because they dam them up, really the best way to prevent beaver on their land is to make that habitat uninhabitable. So removing the vegetation, the food that they like, willows, cottonwoods, stuff like that. So there's certain areas where we have a no tolerance zone. It's just no social tolerance for beavers. In those areas, we need to make it so that we prevent beaver damming altogether. But I guess what this work is trying to show is that wherever we can work with beaver, and we should.
I think we have time for probably one more. What are the regulations that govern beaver introductions, removal, movement?
That really depends on the state. So in Colorado, there's currently not that many regulations for, in Colorado, only Colorado Parks and Wildlife can relocate beaver. There is a permitting process, but it's really hard to get a permit. In other states like California, no one, not even state governments, can relocate beaver. And in other states, it's a lot less restricted. I'll just answer this last question I see real quick about attitude changes amongst landowners and land managers. There's definitely been a huge, I've seen a big shift in perspective, not just on how to manage these beaver problems. That still needs a lot of work, but especially on using beavers as a restoration tool. That's something that a lot of nonprofits, but also federal governments, federal government agencies have adopted as a tool and are really promoting. So that gives me a lot of hope that there's so many other people who believe in the beaver. So I think that's about all the time we have.
Yeah, thank you so much, Malcolm. That was super informative and really well done. So thank you.